the whole board, we're always looking for more information to try and inform us so we can make the best possible decision. And it came to my attention that there were several high performing districts in the western suburbs or outside of Boston that had switched to earlier school start times for elementary and later ones for middle and high school. So Katrina and I, over the last couple of weeks, have had conversations with 4 of those districts with members of the school committee there. And Brian, if you want to do a screen share, I just made a short little presentation to inform you of where we are. We can send that out. All right, so that's where we are. We can move on to the next slide. And here you can see, so Lincoln Sudbury has, their high school starting at 8:25, middle at 8:30, and the elementary starts at 7:55 with the first school bus pickup at 7:10 a.m. Wayland similarly is 8:35, 8:40, 7:55 for elementary with the first bus pickup at 7:11 a.m. And there are, for all of these schools, there are actually slightly earlier bus pickups that we didn't include because they deal with students coming from Boston out to their districts. So we were really just keeping our focus on the communities of and the people that lived in Lincoln, Sudbury, Wayland, Weston, and Dover, Sherburne. So then Weston again, they push their high school, middle school to 8:45, elementaries 8 a.m. and the first bus pickup 7:08 a.m. Dover, Sherburne, you can see it's 7:50 a.m. for elementary, similarly 8:35 middle and high, with the first bus pickup about 10 minutes earlier than some of the other districts of 7 a.m. So it's in terms of we thought this was interesting because in terms of the elementary first bus pickup, it was very similar to what we were contemplating with our scenario A. The next slide would be great. So you can see that all of these districts are high performing. I double checked it today, niche A+ school districts. We asked, and each has a significant and a growing number of dual working parents. The commutes, I think, are a little bit shorter on average, maybe than in New Canaan. It takes, they varied from 1/2 hour to an hour and a half, but on average, it seemed for most of these communities, during rush hour, it would be about an hour to get into Boston. The school start times discussion and the changes were all fueled by really the same research that we've discussed and presented, showing the need to move start times later for teens and what the impact of sleep is and their changing circadian rhythms. And then there was, what was interesting is these start times have been changed recently. Weston was 2018. Wayland was 2019, and Lincoln, Sudbury, and Dover, Sherburne really were just started this fall. So I'll go into more detail about what all the issues that each community faced and how it's worked out. But the gist of it was that each of the districts was pleased with the new start times, thought that they had seen improvements because of them, and would choose to implement them, all over again. So one of the things that was interesting to Katrina and I is the issues that the next slide will show, the issues raised during the planning, and each of these communities had extensive multi-year planning, are the same issues that we're facing in our community. And there was no joint view in any one of these communities as to what should be done. You had parents who wanted different things, teachers who wanted different things. There were always concerns at every school about the impact on high school sports. There were concerns in every school that the high school and middle school students would simply stay up later and not get more sleep. There were concerns that there was going to be a negative impact on family time, particularly for the elementary students, as they would have to go to bed earlier. The same questions of, nobody wanted latchkey kids, issues about potential after school jobs. And then throughout the other districts, as everybody was sort of weighing what to do, There were also concerns that they didn't want to push elementary students too late because they would, everybody noticed, everybody was reporting that they had reduced attention toward the end of the day after lunch. And so there's one district that had elementary I think it was Wayland, had elementary at 8:30. They considered pushing it to 9, and there was a lot of resistance to that. And so they ended up instead doing, I think that was 7:55 a.m. So these communities grappled in depth with the same issues that we have been addressing and grappling with in our community. So we also asked like what changes and what they did to make the transition helpful, which is shown in the next slide. And so, and we got some very interesting sort of answers to that. It's similar to the types of changes and everything that we're talking about. Everybody worked very carefully with groups to make sure that there would be affordable early drop-off programs for the middle school and after-school programs for the elementary students. Interestingly, in 2 of the communities, they actually started an early drop-off for middle school students because they were coming in later. And they had so few students that enrolled. I think this was Wayland, that they actually dropped it after half a year because they didn't need it. So families found workarounds there by and large. But they still felt it was important, certainly during implementation, to have offered that. And there was, for the elementary students, there was generally an uptick in the number of parents who were interested in after school care there. So they were working with third-party providers and other town agencies to sort of make certain that would work easily for parents. They made certain that at the middle and the high school that you could not add club sports or music practices prior to the start of school, with very minor exceptions. We thought it was interesting that Wayland actually said, if you started prior to our old school start time, then we'll allow you to start prior to the current school start time, but nobody else could switch. So, you have to be a little flexible to make it work for everybody. And in all the districts, teacher meetings, which had been after school for the middle and high school, all generally moved oftentimes to before school. So I thought it was interesting that all 4 high schools had the block schedule. At Dover Sherburne, they actually added an X block for the last half hour. And that was to provide extra help and to allow band and chorus. They had, however they did their scheduling, many students had not been able to take band and chorus because it conflicted with a lot of other classes, particularly AP labs. And so they're trying this new X block to help that conflict. And Dover, Sherburne, and Weston did allow for the early release of students, sometimes occasionally for high school sports teams. Weston is actually a smaller community than some of its surrounding communities, and so their teams sometimes have to travel farther. But no, there were a lot of, I forget which school district said, we're going to have to cut all kinds of teams because we're making this transition, high school teams, and no high school teams were cut. They figured out ways to keep all that working. So in general, like the impact, you say they all the districts said that they were happy to have this change. So there was sort of like, what was the impact on student education and wellness? Well, Weston actually started, a year and a half before the pandemic. So they had the longest runway, and they had done a survey before the pandemic started. And that study showed that their teams were getting more sleep, that absenteeism was lower, and that tardiness was reduced at their middle and high schools. And they, both Weston and Sudbury started in the fall of 2019. So they had, fall of 2019. So they had a little bit of a runway too. And they said that the school board members were surprised. They said, they had hundreds and hundreds of emails and input before the change, and after the change, they weren't going so far as to say that everybody was delighted with it, but they said that in their communities, families generally adjusted well, and that the new school start times were working, and it was no longer a divisive issue where people were coming back and saying you have to change back. Lincoln, Sudbury, Wayland, and Dover Suburban just started these programs during the pandemic last fall. They have had their kids in, hybrid and full-time, though less, not quite as early as we got our children back. And the reports that they had are positive from the teachers and the students about the new school hours. The teachers of elementary students in Lincoln Sudbury have reported that their students are alert, more engaged, and not as tired as they were at the end of the day. But those districts really want to, when they can get back to normal, hopefully in the fall, want to get some hard data then, and analyze it a little bit further. So that was anyhow, that was what we found out, and we thought you might be interested in hearing it. Any questions?
Thank you, Penny.
Penny, I have a question. And first of all, thank you, Penny and Katrina, for doing that work. They seem to be really good analogs and very interesting to see. So thank you for that. It's interesting that all four didn't do it simultaneously, but very close together. And I'm wondering, was there coordination among the towns, or did one district see the next district and then follow? I'm curious as to how that rolled out, if you got any color in that regard.
I think that one district saw the next district and then followed. But sometimes the districts, it took a long time, and there was a lot of community support for doing it. And with the implementation committees, oftentimes, since Boston is such a medically intensive community, they had doctors on or researchers who are actually involved with school sleep research, saying that this research is real. Our teens are affected, and we should look at this because of the crisis that we have in this amount of stress that teens are feeling these days.
Yeah, and I would add to that I think I saw in one of the presentations, or someone mentioned it's over 23 districts have changed pretty recently in the Boston, greater Massachusetts area, and it's definitely more of a trend, I would say. Whereas I think they're a little bit ahead of changing and studying this, which makes sense given the research intensive area that it is. That I would say they're kind of leading the way with a few other states right there with them in terms of these changes. Brendan, you had a question, I think, and then Jen.
I just wanted to say thank you for presenting that. Very, very helpful. And I agree with Carl. It seems like good analogs to our situation. You may have said at the beginning, do you know how long it took them to evaluate the potential change and implement it?
Well, one district started 9 years ago. And then, which is sort of like our old school sleep time survey, by the League of Women Voters, and there just wasn't enough support. And then when their new superintendent came in about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, he did a survey, and determined that school start times was really the initiative that had been dropped that people wanted him to pick up. And so he took it on. It was generally a several year process. When we talked, one district said that they made the decision, I think it was in the spring of 2018, that they were going to change. They hadn't actually picked their final scenario yet, but they said that they were going to change, and that they weren't going to put that change in until the fall of 2019. So over a year later, because they wanted to make certain they could work with everybody in the community and it would be a smooth implementation. So nobody just did it quickly. It was really over at least 2 or 3 years.
Thank you.
Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, just thank you so much for doing this work. For the elementary schools, do you know what time, it might be in the presentation, but and I think you just sent a link, Brian, but I don't have it. Do you know what time the elementary schools were before the change? Like, were they late? Were they 9 o'clock and they went?
Do you have my notes on that? I know 2 of them were at about 8:30. And I think the one that was at 8:25 that moved earlier, that was the one district that didn't have as much as much pushback from parents on it. You know, a little bit like what we've seen. I
Right.
think less pushback from South parents than from East School and West School community. I
And did you?
I can email that to you. I have.
Yeah,
it.
no, I was just curious. And again, from the sound of what you said, it seems like they're happy with the decision that they made, and that the younger kids seemed, since they had that track, showing that they were tired or after lunch, whatever, that they were happy with the change, and everyone seems to have adjusted. That's what you said,
Well,
right?
and what I would say
Somewhat.
is what was interesting is the target for everybody was 8 a.m. And obviously not all those districts, only one of them got there. They all started off with earlier start times in the proposal and pushed, did everything they could to grab like another 5 minutes to get as close to 8 a.m. as they could. So that was, which is what we've tried to do.
Sounds familiar. Exactly.
Yeah.
Julie,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
So again, echoing my thanks for your research on this, Penny and Katrina. And Jen did ask my question about elementary students, but I was going to just make an observation that geographically, where Boston is because of where Boston is, they're darker for later in the morning. So I find it interesting, that kids are being picked up still at 7:10 and 7 o'clock, some of their earliest bus times, which would probably be still in the dark maybe for them, but for us,
But it wasn't in the dark. It was twilight. They had done this twilight studies like we had.
Okay, yeah.
So they were sort of in the same. It was similar, but certainly the twilight, if anything, would be a little bit later because it's further north.
Right. So just thinking of us that we would have that much more light, in terms of our earliest pickups. So.
Yeah, no, those were similar concerns and that they had to address.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions, comments? I swear I saw Sherry raise. Oh, you moved. There you are. Okay, go ahead.
I'm jumping in late here. Sorry about that. But thank you, Penny and Katrina, for that research analysis. I was wondering if you gleaned any best practices regarding how the ecosystem around the school district was able to adapt. So I know we've got a lot of concerns about, childcare and after school activities and so forth, whether or not, they can shift. And I'm just wondering if there's any best practices to be learned from this research that we could apply.
I think it's that you want, as we're planning to have, a big implementation committee where everybody can raise the concerns that they have, and you can address and fix as many of them as possible. And that you have to maintain your flexibility. You don't want to be too rigid and say absolutely nothing before middle school and high school, because there are going to be a few exceptions that you might want to make. But you need to hold true to the sort of the general gist of it. One of the things that we've talked about is there's not as much research on the elementary end that we've seen as for the high school, but all the anecdotal evidence that these that these school districts were giving was exactly what we're getting and hearing about elementary students and the times that they best learn.
Brendan?
Yeah, just following up on the implementation committee, and maybe this is for later in the discussion, but I just wondered whether you learned whether their sort of committees had, like a subset that would focus on after school programming and, work with the administration and other organizations in town to facilitate that. I wonder whether we need to do something like that and whether those towns, use that kind of format.
We didn't think to get into that granular detail, but all these people were so, they immediately responded to us. They wanted to tell us what their experience was. They wanted to help us wherever they could. And so we can go back to them.
And
They
there
know
were
it's difficult.
there were a couple of interesting examples that were given. The communities, different districts referred to having a doctor on their committee just to help sort of shepherd some of the research and do some of the communication around that. Others talked about athletic directors and coaches and the importance of engaging, the sports groups, and just having learning. I think they were called listening sessions with elementary school parents. There were a lot of good examples of ways that committees work with their districts, and outreach and community input through not just up until the decision, but more importantly after, to make sure that the implementation went smoothly. So. Other questions? Okay.